In the autumn of 1941, long before American soldiers fired their first sustained shots against the Wehrmacht in Europe, German generals were already forming opinions about the United States Army, opinions shaped less by direct combat and more by intelligence reports, diplomatic observations, memories of the First World War, and deeply rooted assumptions about culture, race, industry, and warfare. Inside Berlin, in the marble halls of the Benler Block and the smoky map rooms of the OKW, senior officers such as Franz Halder, Wilhelm Keitel, and Alfred Jodl discuss America not as an imminent battlefield enemy, but as a distant industrial giant whose military competence remained, in their view, unproven. Their early judgments would matter deeply, because underestimating an enemy had already become a dangerous German habit. For many German commanders, their mental image of American soldiers in 1941 was still frozen in the past. Men remember from 1917 and 1918, when fresh U.S. divisions arrived late to the Western Front, enthusiastic but inexperienced, relying heavily on French and British leadership. Officers who had fought in the Kaiser's army, including Rundstedt and Blaskowitz, carried those memories forward, quietly telling younger staff officers that Americans were brave but naive, rich but untested. In their private diaries, some German officers wrote that America had money instead of military tradition, a phrase that circulated quietly but confidently within the officer corps. Adolf Hitler himself set the tone from the top. In conversations recorded by aides and later preserved in the Tischgespräch, Hitler repeatedly dismissed the American army as a mixed force weakened by democracy, racial diversity, and what he believed was a lack of discipline. He mocked American officers as businessmen in uniform and described U.S. soldiers as physically impressive but mentally soft. These views, steeped in ideology rather than intelligence, filtered downward to the command structure and shaped how field marshals discussed the possibility of eventual conflict with the United States. German military intelligence, the Abwehr under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, presented a more nuanced picture. Reports reaching Berlin in mid-1941 described the U.S. Army as small, barely 1.6 million men even after expansion, but rapidly growing, supported by a vast industrial base unlike anything Germany could match. Analysts noted American strengths in logistics, mechanization, and mass production, while also pointing out serious weaknesses: limited combat experience, outdated doctrine, and officer corps still learning modern combined arms warfare. These reports were often overshadowed by Hitler's louder, more confident dismissals. On the Eastern Front, where German forces were deep into Operation Barbarossa by late 1941, the war against the Soviet Union reinforced dangerous assumptions. German generals, still convinced of their own operational superiority, believed that even if America entered the war, it would take years before U.S. forces could meaningfully challenge the Wehrmacht in Europe. Halder wrote in his war diary in September 1941 that America lacks the trained formations necessary for continental warfare, adding that any American threat would be industrial, not tactical. This distinction would later prove fatal to German planning. Rommel, then fighting in North Africa, offered a slightly different view. Although he had not yet faced American troops directly, Rommel paid close attention to British supply chains and American material support flowing into the Middle East. He reportedly told members of his staff in Tripoli that American equipment was robust, simple, and produced in frightening quantities. While he still doubted American battlefield leadership, Rommel was among the first senior German commanders to sense that American logistics might eventually outweigh German tactical brilliance. German naval commanders also contributed to the discussion. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder and U-boat commander Karl Donitz viewed America through a maritime lens, recognizing the United States as a formidable naval industrial power. Donitz, in particular, warned in late 1941 that American shipbuilding capacity posed a long-term threat to Germany's Atlantic strategy. Even so, he believed that American sailors, like their soldiers, would require time and blood to learn the realities of modern war. Cultural arrogance played a central role in shaping German attitudes. Many Wehrmacht officers, educated in elite military academies, viewed warfare as an art refined through centuries of European conflict. They struggled to imagine Americans, newcomers from across the Atlantic, mastering this art quickly. Conversations recorded among staff officers frequently contrasted European war thinking, with what they derisively called American technical warfare, suggesting that machines could never replace instinct, experience, and tradition. At the same time, German propaganda reinforced these assumptions for domestic and military audiences alike. Newsreels portrayed Americans as clumsy, overfed, and distracted by luxury, while emphasizing racial divisions and labor unrest within the United States. This propaganda was not merely for civilians. It circulated within the armed forces, subtly reinforcing the belief that American soldiers would lack cohesion and resilience under fire. Yet beneath the surface confidence, cracks were already forming. Some younger officers, particularly those trained in mechanized and armored warfare, quietly admired American engineering and motorization. They studied U.S. vehicle designs, aircraft production numbers, and industrial output figures with growing unease. A few officers reportedly remarked that America's true strength would not be revealed in its first battles, but in its ability to replace losses endlessly. By November 1941, as tensions escalated in the Atlantic and American destroyers escorted British convoys ever closer to German U-boats, the question of American military capability became harder to dismiss. Incidents like the USS Reuben James sinking forced German commanders to acknowledge that the United States was already fighting an undeclared war at sea. Still, many believed that even if war came, it would remain peripheral compared to the decisive struggle in the East. Inside Hitler's inner circle, confidence remained dangerously high. Hitler told Mussolini that America would collapse under the strain of a two-ocean war, dismissing President Roosevelt as a merchant politician. These words were not idle talk. They shaped strategic decisions, including the belief that Germany could afford to provoke the United States without facing immediate consequences. By December 1941, German generals stood at a crossroads perception and reality. They had not yet faced American soldiers in Europe, but they had already judged them too quickly, too confidently, and too heavily influenced by ideology and past experience. The image of the American army as inexperienced, undisciplined, and slow-moving became an assumption embedded in German planning, one that would soon collide violently with reality. Unknowingly, German commanders were setting themselves up for one of the greatest miscalculations of the war. They believed they understood the American soldier before ever meeting him in battle, and in doing so, they underestimated not just an army, but a nation learning how to fight a modern war at unprecedented speed. By the time the United States formally entered the war in December 1941, German generals were no longer dealing with a theoretical opponent but an emerging reality. Yet their perceptions lagged dangerously behind events. Inside the OKW headquarters in Berlin, briefings began to include more frequent references to American mobilization figures, factory output, and training programs. But these hard facts were often filtered through layers of ideological bias and overconfidence. Officers like Keitel and Jodl listened to reports describing millions of American men entering uniform, yet still framed the discussion around how long it would take before those men could fight like Europeans, a phrase that revealed more about German assumptions than American capabilities. Franz Halder's diary during late 1941 and early 1942 provides a rare window into German high command's evolving but conflicted thinking. Halder acknowledged that American industry was staggering in scale, noting shipyards, aircraft factories, and vehicle plants operating at a tempo Germany could not match. Yet in the same entries, he questioned whether this industrial power could translate into battlefield effectiveness, writing that numbers of machines do not equal operational art. This belief that German command culture could overcome material inferiority remained deeply ingrained. On the ground, German officers stationed in occupied France began to encounter early signs of American involvement even before U.S. troops arrived. American-built trucks, radios, and weapons flowed steadily into British hands via Lend-Lease, and German intelligence officers reported that British mobility and firepower had noticeably improved. Some staff officers quietly warned that they were not just fighting Britain anymore, but Britain backed by America's factories. Still, these warnings struggled to gain traction against Hitler's insistence that America lacked the will for sustained war. German Air Force commanders, particularly those within the Luftwaffe, paid closer attention to American potential. Hermann Göring's bombastic dismissals masked a quieter anxiety among Luftwaffe planners who studied U.S. aircraft production numbers. Reports circulated estimating that America could outproduce Germany in fighters and bombers within a year, a prediction that many initially dismissed as exaggerated. Yet officers like General Adolf Galland privately admitted concern, noting that American aircraft emphasized range, reliability, and ease of maintenance over elegance, qualities well suited for a long war. At sea, Karl Donit's assessments grew increasingly urgent. By early 1942, he recognized that American entry into the Atlantic would fundamentally alter the balance of naval warfare. While he believed U.S. anti-submarine tactics were initially crude, he also observed that American shipyards replaced losses with alarming speed. Donitz warned that Germany was entering a race it could not win unless the U-boat campaign delivered decisive results quickly. His concerns, however, were often drowned out by Hitler's fixation on land warfare. German generals also closely analyzed American military culture through captured documents, press reports, and diplomatic cables. They saw an army that encouraged initiative among junior officers, tolerated questioning of authority, and emphasized flexibility, traits that some German commanders admired but others interpreted as weakness. To men raised in a rigid Prussian tradition, the idea that a lieutenant might openly debate a major seemed dangerously undisciplined. Few realized that this very flexibility would later become one of the U.S. Army's greatest strengths. Racial ideology continued to poison German assessments. Hitler and several senior officers openly doubted the effectiveness of an army drawn for what they considered a racially mixed society. They believed cohesion under fire required ethnic and cultural uniformity, failing to understand how shared training, purpose, and leadership could bind diverse soldiers together. This prejudice led to a systematic underestimation of American morale and resilience, especially under prolonged combat conditions. In occupied Europe, resistance movements began reporting rumors of eventual American landings, and German garrison commanders dismissed these stories as propaganda meant to boost civilian morale. They believed that even if Americans landed, they would fight cautiously, relying heavily on artillery and air power rather than bold maneuver. This belief shaped defensive planning, reinforcing static positions rather than preparing for the kind of fast-moving operations the Americans would later conduct alongside British forces. Rommel's perspective continued to diverge subtly from Berlin's consensus. Although he still doubted American battlefield experience, he warned that once engaged, American commanders would adapt quickly. He reportedly told his staff that an army with unlimited fuel and vehicles learns faster than one that must conserve every leader. This insight, though understated, hinted at a deeper understanding of how industrial power could accelerate tactical learning. German generals also misread American political resolve. Many believed the United States was entering the war reluctantly, driven by Roosevelt rather than popular support. They expected war weariness, internal division, and political pressure to limit America's commitment. This assumption ignored the unifying shock of Pearl Harbor and the deep cultural shift that transformed American society into a fully mobilized war machine almost overnight. Training assessments further distorted German thinking. Reports suggested that American soldiers received shorter training cycles than German troops, reinforcing the belief that U.S. units would be brittle under pressure. What these reports failed to capture was the American emphasis on continuous training, replacement systems, and rapid doctrinal updates, mechanisms that allowed units to improve even while fighting. By early 1942, the German High Command found itself trapped between conflicting realities. On paper, America looked inexperienced and inefficient. In factories and shipyards, it looked unstoppable. Instead of reconciling these contradictions, many German generals chose the interpretation that best suited their existing beliefs, that German skill would compensate for American mass. This choice was not merely analytical. It was psychological, rooted in pride and fear of acknowledging an enemy too large to defeat. As the war widened, German perceptions of the American army hardened into doctrine. Planning assumptions treated U.S. forces as slow, predictable, and reliant on overwhelming firepower. These assumptions would shape German responses in North Africa, Italy, and eventually Normandy. They were built not on first-hand experience, but on a mixture of memory, ideology, and selective intelligence. By the end of this phase, German generals believed they understood the American soldier well enough to defeat him. In reality, they had only constructed an image, one that underestimated America's capacity to learn, adapt, and absorb losses. This misjudgment would not be corrected in conference rooms or intelligence briefings, but on battlefields where assumptions met reality under fire. By late 1942, the first real combat encounters between German and American forces began to tear holes in the assumptions formed back in 1941, and nowhere was this more evident than in North Africa. German officers who had once dismissed American troops as inexperienced amateurs now faced formations that, while flawed, showed an alarming capacity to absorb punishment and keep advancing. After early clashes, reports sent back to Berlin no longer spoke with ridicule but with caution, noting that American units regrouped faster than expected and returned to the fight with renewed force, supported by an ever-growing weight of artillery, armor, and air power. Field reports from German commanders under Rommel revealed a shift in tone that bordered on unease. Officers described American soldiers as poorly coordinated at times, yet stubbornly persistent, continuing attacks even after suffering heavy losses. One German regimental commander wrote that Americans seemed less concerned with elegance and more concerned with momentum, a subtle acknowledgement that brute pressure, when applied relentlessly, could break even well-prepared defenses. This was not how the Wehrmacht had been trained to think about warfare. Rommel himself began to reassess earlier judgments. Though still critical of American tactical execution, he increasingly emphasized their logistical superiority. He observed that American columns appeared endlessly supplied, with fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles arriving almost without pause. In contrast, German units rationed fuel and cannibalized damaged equipment. Rommel reportedly told his staff that the Americans fight with factories behind them, a statement that captured the growing realization that battlefield skill could not be separated from industrial depth. Within the German general staff, internal debates intensified. Some officers argued that American performance merely reflected inexperience, and that time favored Germany before the United States could refine its methods. Others warned that the Americans were learning at a pace Germany could not match, precisely because they could afford to make mistakes and still continue fighting. These debates rarely reach Hitler in unfiltered form, as subordinates often softened conclusions to avoid confrontation. German intelligence assessments began to change language, replacing words like clumsy and green with phrases such as methodical and heavily supported. Analysts noted that American officers showed a willingness to rotate commanders, revise doctrine, and openly analyze failures, practices that contrasted sharply with Germany's increasingly rigid command culture under Hitler. Ironically, what had once been viewed as weakness now appeared to be a strength. The Luftwaffe's encounters with American air power further shattered earlier assumptions. German pilots initially underestimated American flyers, believing them inferior to British veterans. However, they quickly noticed that American formations returned again and again, flying tight formations, learning from losses, and steadily improving coordination. German airmen reported that American aircraft might lack finesse, but their numbers and endurance were overwhelming, forcing the Luftwaffe into a defensive posture it was ill-prepared to sustain. On the Atlantic front, Donit's fears proved justified. American shipbuilding output exceeded even pessimistic German estimates. U-boats sank ships at impressive rates, but replacement hulls appeared faster than they could be destroyed. German naval officers came to understand that American strength lay not in any single tactical brilliance, but in the sheer impossibility of exhausting their resources. This realization struck at the core of German strategic thinking. Captured American soldiers also altered perceptions. German interrogators noted that American troops were often well informed about the broader war, confident in eventual victory, and surprisingly frank during questioning. Unlike some European armies, American soldiers frequently spoke of home, industry, and national purpose as sources of strength. German officers found this attitude difficult to categorize, as it did not align with traditional notions of militarized discipline. As 1943 approached, the contrast between German expectations and reality widened. German generals had anticipated a cautious, politically fragile opponent. Instead, they encountered an army backed by a society fully committed to total war. American civilians worked longer hours. Factories expanded continuously, and political dissent diminished rather than grew. German intelligence officers increasingly warned that American morale was not cracking. It was hardening. This forced a painful reassessment among some senior commanders. They began to admit, at least privately, that Germany had underestimated not just American soldiers, but American systems. Training pipelines, replacement depots, logistics chains, and command flexibility formed an ecosystem that regenerated combat power faster than German planners could disrupt it. War, they realized too late, was no longer a contest of elite armies alone. Yet even as evidence mounted, denial persisted at the highest levels. Hitler continued to describe American soldiers as mechanized but spiritless, insisting that German willpower would prevail. This ideological stubbornness froze German strategy at the very moment adaptability was most needed. Commanders who questioned these views found themselves sidelined or ignored. By the time German generals fully grasped the implications of American power, the strategic window for defeating the United States had closed. What began in 1941 as dismissal had transformed into reluctant respect, then into fear of an enemy whose strength could not be measured by traditional military standards. The Americans had not needed to be perfect. They only needed to be persistent. Looking back, German officers would later admit that their greatest mistake was not underestimating American soldiers individually, but misunderstanding the nature of modern warfare itself. They failed to see that wars were no longer won solely by brilliance at the front, but by the ability of entire societies to sustain pressure over years. America embodied this shift more completely than any nation before it. And this realization raises unsettling questions. How often do military leaders misjudge their enemies by relying on old assumptions, cultural bias, or past experience? Can industrial power, adaptability, and learning outweigh early battlefield skill? If German generals had truly understood America in 1941, would their strategy have changed, or was the outcome already inevitable once the United States entered the war?